Leave? The word fell from Torin's mouth at the first pale breach of dawn, and Celine heard it the way she had always heard thunderclaps, a half-second after the strike, when the damage was already done. She was standing at the threshold of the great hall in the clothes she had slept in, her dark hair unbound, her feet bare against the cold stone. 37 members of the Ashvale pack stood behind their Alpha King in a loose crescent. Elders, enforcers, women who had braided her hair at festivals and shared bread at her table. Not one of them looked away. They watched, because watching was easier than refusing him, and in the Ashvale pack, nothing had ever been easier than refusing Torin. She had woken to the sound of boots outside her door. A summons at that hour always meant a tribunal, but she had assumed, because she was foolish enough to still assume such things, that she would at least be permitted shoes. She was not. The floor was cold. Torin's face was colder. He stood 10 feet from her, with his arms at his sides and his jaw set in that particular angle she had loved once, the one that meant he had already made a decision and was merely delivering it. His silver eyes, the mark of his bloodline, the mark she had once believed meant something, did not waver. He had looked at her with those eyes on the night of their bonding ceremony, 7 years ago, and she had believed then that she was seeing all of him. She understood now that she had only ever seen the parts he chose to show. "Celine of the Ashvale pack," he said, and the formal phrasing was the second blow, worse than the word itself. "By order of the Alpha King and the Elder Council, you are cast from Ashvale territory. You will not return. You will carry nothing that belongs to this pack." He paused. One breath, effective at dawn. Dawn was already here. The mate bond between them, that deep, involuntary knowing she had carried in her sternum for 7 years like a second heartbeat, pulsed once, hard, as if it recognized what was happening even before she did. Then it contracted, tight and burning, the way a rope burns the hands of someone falling. She did not ask why. She already knew she would not be told. That was the point. 37 people watched her walk out of the great hall with bare feet and no coat and nothing to her name, and not one voice called after her. She had been 12 years old when her mother first brought her to the Ashvale holding. They had traveled 3 days through pine-broken mountain country, her mother's hand warm and steady on her shoulder the whole way, telling her not to be afraid. The Ashvale pack was powerful, her mother said. Old blood, honorable. Celine had believed her. The holding was built into the rock face of the Ashvale Ridge. Stone walls, timber roofs, fires that never seemed to go fully out even in summer. It smelled of wood smoke and cold water and the particular mineral cleanness of high altitude, and Celine, who had grown up in a flatland settlement that smelled of salt and river mud, decided she loved it before she had even seen it properly. She met Torin on her 3rd day. She had been helping carry water from the well near the east gate. She was careful, in those early weeks, to be useful in ways that were visible, when she heard someone behind her say her name as a question. She turned around, and a boy stood there. He was 16 and tall for it, with his father's silver eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, and a way of standing that suggested he already understood the weight of what he was going to inherit. He was looking at her with a directness that startled her, not rude but complete, as though he had decided to see all of her at once, rather than looking away politely as the other young wolves did. "You're the girl from the Flatlands," he said. "Celine," she said, "not the girl from the Flatlands." He looked at her for another moment, and then, unexpectedly, honestly, he laughed. It transformed his face entirely. For a single, unguarded second, he was just a boy who had found something genuinely funny, and Celine felt something unlock in her chest that she would not have a name for until much later. "Torin," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it, and her wolf, newly come into her strength at 12, still surprising her with its certainty, went absolutely still inside her, the way an animal goes still when it recognizes something it has been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting. She did not tell anyone. She was 12 years old, and he was 16, and she understood, even then, that the mate bond at its earliest was a private thing, a seed rather than a fruit, and it needed quiet to grow in. She watched him from a careful distance for 5 years. She watched him train. He was tireless, methodical, precise, in the way that frustrated his sparring partners because he never seemed to try very hard and still landed every strike. She watched him in council sessions where his father still led but increasingly deferred to him. She watched him with the pack children, who followed him in clusters because he answered their questions seriously instead of dismissing them. She watched him read, alone in the library corner, turning pages with one hand and rubbing the back of his neck with the other when something interested him. She filed all of it away. She did not know what she was building toward. She only knew she was building something. On the night of her 17th birthday, the pack gathered for the autumn bonfire, and Torin, 21 by then, already carrying the weight of his father's illness, already more alpha than not, crossed the entire length of the gathering to stand beside her without any apparent reason. He didn't say much. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, and watched the fire, and occasionally handed her something to eat. After a while, she said, "You walked all the way over here for this?" "I walked all the way over here for you," he said, as though this was a simple and reasonable thing to say. He was still looking at the fire. Something in her chest turned over so completely, she had to breathe through it. "Torin," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." He meant the bond. He had felt it too, she understood. Had probably felt it for longer than she realized. He turned to look at her then, and those silver eyes were no longer cool. They were full of a warmth so careful and so deliberate that she understood it had cost him something to let her see it. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just needed you to know I know." That was how it started. Slowly, over the next 2 years, in careful increments, conversations at the library, walks along the ridge in the early morning, evenings by the fire where they sat close enough to touch, but rarely did, because both of them seemed to understand that when they finally closed the distance, it would change everything, and they were not quite ready to give up the delicious, aching anticipation of the moment before. He became alpha at 22 when his father's health finally failed. She stood at the back of the ceremony and felt the bond between them shift and deepen as the authority of his pack settled into his blood, and she pressed her hand against her own sternum and breathed. They were bonded formally when she was 19 and he was 23. It was not a grand ceremony. Torin was not a man who performed things. He came to her in the early morning before the pack was awake, stood in the doorway of her room, and said, "I want this to be a choice you make, not a thing that happens to you." She had chosen. 7 years. 7 years of standing beside him in council chambers and at pack borders and through 2 border disputes and 1 vicious winter and the slow rebuilding of the trade agreement with the Duskfall pack to the north. 7 years of sleeping with her back against the warmth of him and waking to find that he had, in sleep, curved around her with one hand flattened against her ribs as if making sure she was still there. 7 years of being known, or believing she was. She had believed, somehow, that she had finally found the place she was made for. She had been wrong. She did not know, as she walked away from the ash veil holding at dawn with bare feet and no coat, exactly which piece of it had broken. She did not know what she had been accused of, or by whom, or when the decision had been made. She only knew that Torin had made it, and that the Elder Council had signed it, and that 37 people had watched without speaking. The ground was cold. The pine needles were sharp underfoot. She walked north, not because she had a plan, but because north was away, and away was the only direction available to her. The first hour was the worst. She moved through the automatic grief of a body that did not yet believe it was not going home. Her hands kept reaching for things that were not there. The coat she wore on cold mornings, the small knife she carried at her belt, the steady, low hum of the pack bond that had been part of her internal landscape for 7 years. Gone. All of it severed in the same moment, cleanly, the way a rope is cut rather than the way it frays. The mate bond was not gone. She had expected it to be. She had been cast out, not released, but she had expected that Torin would have found some way to sever it along with everything else, because if he had decided she needed to go, then surely he would also decide he did not want to feel her. But the bond remained, thin and taut and aching, a wire stretched to its limit. She could feel him the way she could feel a bruise without pressing it, aware of it at all times, the specific geography of the pain. She did not press. The mate bond told her that Torin was moving through his morning as though nothing had happened. She could feel, faintly, the shape of his attention, distributed across pack matters, sharp and organized. She could not feel regret in him. She could not feel grief. This was worse than the cold. She found a deer path heading uphill and followed it because deer paths usually led to water, and she needed to think, and she found it easier to think when she was moving towards something purposeful. The pine forest closed around her, tall and indifferent. The early autumn light filtered down in thin columns. Somewhere high above her, a hawk turned in the pale sky. She had lived in this forest for 19 years. She knew its deer paths and its ridgelines, and the places where the snow came early and the streams ran dry by August. She was not afraid of the forest. But she was, she realized, genuinely afraid for the first time in years, because she had no idea what she had done to warrant this, and not knowing meant not knowing whether she could have stopped it, and not knowing whether she could have stopped it meant not knowing whether she was safe from herself. She pressed her back against a pine tree and breathed until the wave passed. The charge, she learned later, was betrayal of pack intelligence to the Duskfall pack. She learned this from an old woman named Marin, who lived 2 days' walk north of the Ashvale Ridge in a stone cottage that had once been a way station for packless wolves. Marin was 70 years old and had outlived 3 packs and held no allegiances and told the truth with the particular bluntness of someone who has nothing left to protect. "They say you passed information about the eastern border defenses," Marin said, setting a bowl of something hot in front of Celine and sitting down across from her. "The trade route, the patrol rotations, they say you did it deliberately, for payment." Celine stared at the bowl. "I didn't." "I know," Marin said. "I can tell. But I'm not the one who needs convincing." Celine thought about who might need convincing, and the answer she arrived at, Torin, made her stomach turn, because if Torin had needed convincing, he had not been convinced. He had signed the exile order. He had made his determination. The trial, such as it was, had already concluded. "Who brought the charge?" she asked. Marin lifted one shoulder. "Elder Cassia, from what I hear. She came to the council with evidence." "Documents," she said, "with your signature. Letters to the Duskfall Alpha." Celine set down the spoon she had just picked up. Elder Cassia, who had been Torin's father's closest advisor before she was Torin's. Elder Cassia, who had smiled at Celine's bonding ceremony with her mouth only. Elder Cassia, who had always referred to Celine, in the careful way of someone choosing their words precisely, as Torin's mate rather than the Alpha King's consort, a distinction that meant nothing in law, but everything in the unspoken hierarchies of the Ashvale pack. She fabricated them, Celine said. Almost certainly, Marin agreed. She reached across the table and wrapped one dry, strong hand around Celine's wrist. The question is, what you're going to do about it. Celine stayed with Marin for 2 weeks. She slept, which she needed, and ate, which her body demanded, and she cried twice in the dark with her face pressed into a blanket so Marin wouldn't hear, because grief has its own schedule and cannot be argued with. She let herself feel it, the loss of him, the specific, terrible loss of the one person she had been certain of, and then she got up in the mornings and helped Marin with the cottage and let her wolf run at night under the autumn stars. Running helped. She had forgotten how much she loved it, how the wolf's senses clarified everything, reduced the world to scent and sound, and the specific physics of her own body, moving fast through dark air. She was faster than she remembered. She had spent so many years in the holding, in human form, navigating the pack's social architecture, that she had let her wolf go half fallow. Running alone in the forest brought her back to something fundamental. She was not diminished. She had only been elsewhere. On the 14th day, Marin told her something else. She told her, in the careful way of someone presenting a tool rather than a solution, that the Duskfall pack, the same pack Celine had allegedly betrayed information to, had a tradition that Ashvale did not. Their bonding ceremonies involved a secondary rite, a ritual called the witnessing, in which the pack's elder seer recorded the bond in a medium that could not be falsified, a document written in the bonded wolves' combined blood and signed in the moment of the bonding itself, witnessed by the moon. Which means, Celine said slowly, that if there's a Duskfall document with my signature on it, it can be compared against the witnessing record, Marin said. The Duskfall elder seer holds those records. She's neutral. She's been neutral since her predecessor's predecessor. She wouldn't lie for Ashvale or anyone else. Celine looked at the window. Outside, the pines moved in a slow wind. The sky was the pale blue of early autumn, thin and cold and honest. The Duskfall Alpha's name was Ronan. She had met him twice at border negotiations and found him measured, careful, and deeply uninterested in whatever drama Ashvale generated for itself. He would not refuse a request to compare documents. He had no reason to protect Cassia's fabrication. But to reach Duskfall, she would have to travel through the Thornwood. The Thornwood sat between Ashvale and Duskfall territory like a deliberate obstacle, 60 miles of forest so dense and old that the light barely reached the floor, inhabited by something the packs referred to collectively as the Thornwood spirits, not wolves, not humans, not anything that had a name in the common tongue. The Thornwood spirits did not welcome travelers. In the last century, 4 wolves who had attempted to cross the Thornwood alone had not emerged. Celine thought about this for 3 days. Then she thought about Cassia's careful smile, about Torin's voice at dawn, formal and final, about 37 faces that had watched without speaking. She left before sunrise on the 17th day, wearing Marin's second coat and carrying a pack with enough food for a week, and she walked into the Thornwood. The change she felt at the first step across the boundary was not subtle. The air in the Thornwood was different, heavier, saturated with something she had no word for, a kind of weight that sat not on the skin but behind the eyes. The trees here were enormous, their roots above ground and twisting, their bark so dark it was nearly black. There was no birdsong, there was no wind. The forest was absolutely still in the particular way of something that is paying attention. She walked for 6 hours without stopping. On the 7th hour, she heard something, not footsteps, more like the sound a fire makes when it shifts, a soft collapse of structure. She turned and found nothing. She walked on. On the 9th hour, the thornwood showed her what it held. It came from between two roots the size of grown trees, a shape that was not quite wolf and not quite anything else, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, with fur the color of charcoal and eyes that held the particular flat luminescence of something that has been old for so long it no longer remembers youth. It stopped 10 feet from her and regarded her with those flat, bright eyes, and she felt the weight behind her own eyes increase sharply, like a pressure change. She went perfectly still. She did not reach for her wolf. She understood, with a clarity that felt external, like a fact given rather than derived, that the thing in front of her would interpret her wolf as aggression, and that aggression would not serve her here. She held still and let it look at her. It took a long time. When it moved sideways, out of her path, and stood aside. She walked through the space it had vacated, feeling its attention on her back like a hand between her shoulder blades. She did not look back. She lost count of hours after that. The thornwood did not have a day, only degrees of dark. She navigated by the narrow glimpses of sky she caught in the canopy gaps, stars, and when the stars disappeared behind cloud, she navigated by the pull of the mate bond, which surprised her. She had not intended to use it as a compass, but in the thornwood's uniform dark, with no stars and no landmarks, the bond oriented her as reliably as true north. Torin was behind her, to the south and east, steady and specific as a beacon. She walked perpendicular to it and found the boundary of the Duskfall territory in the early hours of the second day. She was shaking when she crossed it, not from fear, from the specific exhaustion of 40 hours of sustained alertness. She sat down at the edge of a stream just inside the Duskfall boundary and drank water with her hands and let her wolf surface just enough to warm her, and she thought about the fact that she had crossed the thornwood, that 4 wolves in a century had tried and not emerged, and she had walked through it in under 2 days. She did not let herself think about what that might mean, not yet. The Duskfall holding was a half-day's walk inside the territory. She arrived in the afternoon at the outer gate and asked to speak with the elder seer. The elder seer's name was Fionn. She was a compact woman somewhere between 50 and 80, with hands that moved quickly and eyes that moved faster, and she listened to Celine's request without expression. When Celine finished, Fionn was quiet for a moment, then said, "You crossed the thornwood." "Yes," Celine said. Fionn looked at her for a long moment. "The records are in the vault," she said. "Come." The documents Cassia had presented to the Ashvale Council were signed with Celine's name in a hand that was close, very close, the kind of close that required practice, but not exact. The loop on the lowercase e was wrong, and the T-crossing was angled incorrectly, and Fionn pointed to both of these things without being asked, with the calm precision of someone who has been doing this for many decades and recognizes a forgery the way a cook recognizes stale bread. "This is not your signature," Fionn said. "No," said Celine. Fionn copied her findings onto 2 sheets of paper, one for Celine and one for the Duskfall archive, and pressed the Duskfall seal to both. She did this without asking permission from the Alpha or the Council, because the Elder Seer's authority over the record was absolute, and had been absolute for 300 years, and this was not a discretionary matter. Then she handed Celine the document and said, "What will you do with this?" Celine looked at the paper in her hand, a document that proved she had been exiled on fabricated evidence, that Cassia had forged her signature, that Torin had cast out his bonded mate, on a lie, without asking her, without giving her the chance to speak. "I'm going to take it home," she said. She said it quietly. She said it without heat, because by then, the anger had cooled into something harder and more durable, something that was not rage, but was made of the same materials. Fionn looked at her with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite admiration. "The Thornwood will be easier going back," she said. "It knows you now." She was right. Selene crossed the Thornwood in 18 hours on the return. The charcoal wolf met her at the center and walked beside her for 6 miles before peeling away into the dark without sound. She did not reach for her own wolf while it walked with her. She walked in human form, matching its pace, and felt the Thornwood's weight behind her eyes shift, become lighter, become almost something she recognized as kinship. When she emerged on the Ashvale side, the sky was clear and the stars were enormous, the way they get in high country on a cold night when there's no wind to blur them. She stopped at the edge of the Thornwood and looked up and felt the mate bond pull sharply, suddenly, as though it had been waiting for her to be within range. Torin knew she was there. She could feel the moment he registered her, a sudden, arrested quality to the bond, as if a breath had been held. She imagined him, wherever he was, going still, feeling her. Good, she thought. Let him feel me. She walked toward the Ashvale, holding through the night. She arrived at first light. The gate guard was a young enforcer named Bram, who had been with the pack for 3 years and genuinely did not know what to do when he saw her. He was 22 and conscientious, and he had the specific expression of someone who is running 2 contradictory instructions in his head at the same time. "The Alpha King cast you out," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm coming back anyway." She walked past him. He did not stop her. Whether this was because he lacked the authority to use force against the Alpha King's bonded mate, or because he had genuinely not decided what the right thing was, she couldn't tell. It didn't matter. She was inside the gate. The holding was waking, fires being lit, children being called in for mourning, the particular sound of a community starting its day. She walked through the courtyard toward the great hall, and people stopped what they were doing to look at her. Some with surprise, some with relief, she thought, though she may have been projecting. One woman, Dara, who had shared bread with her, pressed a hand over her mouth and looked away. Selene walked on. She heard him before she saw him. The bond told her his location the way it always had, that deep, involuntary awareness, and then she heard his voice, short, directive, cutting off someone mid-sentence, and then he came around the corner from the direction of the council chambers with 2 of his senior enforcers behind him, and he stopped. 10 feet of space between them, the same as it had been a month ago. He looked different from what she remembered. He was thinner, not much, but enough, and there was something in the set of his jaw that she had not seen before, a kind of compression, as though he was holding something very tightly in place. His silver eyes found her face and did not move. "Selene," he said. It was not the formal phrasing, just her name, in his voice, which she had spent a month trying to remember correctly and had not managed. The real thing was always different, lower, slightly rougher at the edges, with a warmth in it that he never entirely achieved in her memory. She hated that she noticed it. "We need to speak," she said. "In the council chamber, and Elder Cassia needs to be present." He was still looking at her. The two enforcers behind him exchanged a glance. She watched him assess the situation, the returned exile, the document she was visibly carrying, the fact that the courtyard was filling with people who were listening, and make the calculation that refusing her now would cost more than granting the request. "Come," he said. The council chamber held 12 people, the full elder council, Torin, the two enforcers, and Celine. Cassia arrived last, and Celine watched her face cycle through 3 distinct expressions in the 3 seconds between entering the room and seeing Celine: surprise, calculation, and then the smooth, specific blankness of someone who has decided their best strategy is to give nothing away. She was practiced. Celine had to give her that. She laid the document on the council table. She explained its provenance, the Duskfall Elder Seer, the witnessing records, the specific discrepancies identified. She spoke for 10 minutes without interruption, which was more than she had been permitted to say at dawn a month ago. Several of the elders leaned forward to look at the paper. One of them asked a clarifying question about the seal. She answered it. Torin was seated at the head of the table. He had not taken his eyes off her face since she began speaking. Cassia, when given the chance to respond, made 3 arguments in quick succession. That the Duskfall Seer was not a neutral authority, that the documents she had presented were genuine, and the comparison was flawed, and that Celine's crossing of the Thornwood alone was itself evidence of some unnatural alliance that the council should examine. It was the 3rd argument that finished her. 3 elders turned to look at her with expressions that said, clearly, that accusing a returned exile of witchcraft because she survived something they knew was survivable was a step too far. Elder Davin, who was the eldest and had been largely silent, said, "Cassia, enough." He said it quietly, which was worse than loudly. Celine looked at Torin. He was looking at Cassia, and he was very still. She watched the moment he understood. It was not dramatic, no visible shock, no gesture. It was more like watching something very cold suddenly warm, the way ice does in early spring, slow at first, and then irrevocable. His jaw unlocked, fractionally, his hands flattened on the table. He looked at Cassia for a long time. Then he looked at Celine. The bond between them, which had been a thin, taut wire of pain for the past month, did something she had not expected. It expanded, not closing the distance, not resolving anything, but opening, the way a window opens into a cold morning, sudden and clean, and making the room feel larger than it was. She looked at him and felt everything she had felt for 14 years, and felt it exactly as clearly as she always had. And she also felt the decision she had made in Duskfall's record room, looking at Fion's sealed document. She was not going to be here for his feelings. Not yet. Not without more. Elder Davin called for a formal review. It was not a question. It was the action that follows an obvious conclusion. Cassia remained in the chamber under the watch of the 2 enforcers. The other elders filed out to convene in a secondary room. Celine stayed where she was. When the room was empty except for the 2 of them, Torin rose from his chair and walked around the table. He stopped a few feet away from her. Not the careful 10 feet of the exile, not the ordinary closeness of 7 years of marriage. Something in between. A distance that asked a question without committing to anything. She could feel his warmth. After a month of cold, the specific warmth of him, particular as a voice, as familiar as her own hands, made something in her chest respond before her mind could intercede. The mate bond sang between them, low and urgent and not remotely interested in her reservations. He reached toward her and then stopped, his hand hovering. "Celine," he said. Just that. Her name like an apology and a question and something older than either. She looked at his hand, Torin's hand, the hand she had held through border negotiations, through the hard winter, through the night his father died, when she had sat beside him for 8 hours without speaking because there was nothing useful to say and he had needed presence rather than words. She knew those hands. "You didn't ask me," she said. His hand lowered. "No. You didn't even ask me," she said again, because she needed him to sit with the specific shape of that. 7 years. And you heard one accusation from one source, and you signed the order before the sun came up. I did. He did not try to qualify it. Whatever else Torin was, he did not flinch from his own actions. She had always known this about him. She had, once, considered it a virtue. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid," he said finally. "Because Cassia had documents that looked correct, and I didn't want to look at them too closely. Because part of me," he stopped, started again. "Because I had been afraid for years that you would leave, and when the evidence appeared, it was almost easier to believe it than to fight it." She stared at him. She had not expected honesty. She had expected justification, deflection, the particular defensive architecture of a man who had made a terrible decision and needed to live with himself. She had not expected him to look at her with those silver eyes full of a shame so unguarded she could see every edge of it. "That's not enough," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking for enough. I'm just telling you the truth." She stood very still and felt the mate bond between them, that involuntary knowing, the thing that had been a seed at 12 and a wire under strain for a month, and was now, what? Something larger, something that had survived, which she had not, she realized, been certain it would. He was close enough that if she moved her hand a few inches, she would touch him. She thought about the first bonding morning, 23-year-old Torin in her doorway, saying, "I want this to be a choice you make, not a thing that happens to you." She breathed out slowly. She picked up the Duskfall document from the table and held it. "I crossed the Thornwood," she said, "alone, there and back." He looked at her as though this information was landing alongside everything else, recalibrating something. "I felt it when you came back," he said. "The bond." He pressed a fist briefly against his sternum, the gesture so familiar it made her breath catch. "I felt you. I thought I was—" He didn't finish. "You thought you were imagining it," she said. "Yes." "You weren't." They stood in the empty council chamber with the early morning light coming through the high windows, and the mate bond was a live thing between them, and Celine thought about what Marin had said. "I know. I can tell. About Fiaume. This is not your signature. About the charcoal wolf walking beside her through the Thornwood dark for 6 miles, silent, extending something she might call welcome. About her own wolf, running under autumn stars, with a speed and a sureness she had let herself forget she possessed. She was not the woman who had walked out of this room a month ago. She was not going to be. "I'm not forgiving you today," she said. "I want you to know that clearly." His jaw tightened. "Understood. I'm coming back into this holding because it is my holding, and always was, and because Cassia needs to be held accountable publicly, and because the pack deserves to see that the evidence was false. None of that is about you." "I know," he said. "But I need you to listen to me from now on," she said. "Not when it's easy. Every time. When it matters. Especially when I'm telling you something you don't want to hear. That is what I should have been able to expect. That is what a mate means." He was very still. The light caught the silver in his eyes, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the boy who had crossed the entire length of an autumn gathering to stand beside her without any apparent reason. She had loved that boy's particular brand of courage. the courage of choosing someone deliberately, in front of everyone, without being asked. She needed to see that person again, the real one, the one who had existed before authority made it easier to believe a lie than to protect the truth. "Yes," he said. It was quiet, and it was complete. Not a performance, just the word, carrying all the weight she had asked it to carry. She moved then. Not all the way, not the full closing of the distance, not yet. Just enough. She put her hand over his, where it rested against his sternum. She felt the mate bond between them expand again, that clean opening, and beneath her palm she felt his heartbeat, fast and careful, the heartbeat of someone who is very aware that something important is happening and does not want to do anything wrong. "I came back," she said quietly. "That's what I have today." He turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers. Careful, asking. She let him hold her hand and felt the warmth of him move up her arm and settle in her chest, like something that had been away for a month and remembered exactly where it lived. They stood like that for a while. The morning light moved. Somewhere outside, the holding was fully awake. Then she said, "I want shoes." He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. It transformed his face, the same way it had that first day at the well, and she felt something inside her ease by 1 degree. Just one, but it was real. He found her shoes, and then he went to the door and called Elder Davin back into the chamber, because there was a reckoning to be had, and Celine wanted to be standing up for it, in shoes, in her own holding, with the document from the Duskfall elder seer in her hand. The council's formal review took 4 days. Celine was present for all of it, not as a witness, but as a participant, which was a distinction she had to establish twice and then hold. She sat at the table, and she answered questions, and she asked them, and when Cassia's defenders attempted to raise the argument about the Thornwood again, she looked at them steadily until they stopped. On the 4th day, Elder Davin announced the council's determination. The exile order was to be formally rescinded. The forged documents were to be destroyed, and their creation formally recorded as a violation of pack law. Cassia was to be removed from the Elder Council and placed under a period of supervised isolation pending further proceedings. It was not everything. It was not the full measure of what had been taken from her. The month of cold, the bare feet on the stone floor, the specific humiliation of 37 watching faces. Nothing the council could formally determine would give those things back. But it was true, and it was public, and the pack heard it. After, she walked out into the courtyard. The sky was that deep, saturated blue of a high autumn afternoon, clear down to the horizon. She stood in it and breathed it in, the Ashvale air, wood smoke and cold water and mineral cleanness, and let herself feel it. This was hers. It had always been hers. The exile had been a lie from the beginning. Torin came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He stood close enough that his shoulder was near her shoulder and looked at the same sky she was looking at. After a while he said, "What do you need from me?" She thought about the question. It was the right question. She recognized it as the right question. "Time," she said, "and honesty, and to not have to fight to be believed every time something is difficult." "Yes," he said. Same quiet completeness as before. "And I want a formal role on the council," she said. "Not as your mate, as a council member with my own standing. That should have happened years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "Done," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was watching her with those silver eyes, and the careful warmth in them was present, in full, no longer restrained. She could see all of it, and it was exactly as large as she remembered, which made something in her chest ache sweetly. "You crossed the Thornwood," he said. Not for the first time. He seemed to keep returning to it. "I did," she said. "The Thornwood spirits walked with you. One of them, part of the way." He looked at her steadily. "Do you know what that means? In the old accounts, the records in the Ashvale Library, the ones from 300 years ago, it's written that the Thornwood walks with its kin, not with travelers, not with the brave, with its kin." She turned to look at him fully. "The Thornwood has a blood tie," he said, "to the founding wolves of this region. Your mother's line." He stopped. "I should have found this before. I should have looked." She heard what he was saying underneath the words. "I should have looked at everything more carefully. A long time ago. I should have looked at you." "You found it now," she said. He lifted his hand and touched her face. A single, careful gesture, his thumb against her cheekbone, asking. She let him. The mate bond responded fully, rushing up through her chest with a completeness she had not felt in a month, and she let that too, let herself feel what it actually felt like to be this close to him, warm and known, and devastatingly, simply, right. "I'm not done being angry," she told him. "I know," he said. He kept his hand where it was. "I'll be here." She reached up and put her hand over his, the same way she had in the council chamber, her hand over his, holding it in place. The sky above the holding blazed blue and cold, and the pine ridge caught the last angle of afternoon light, and the pack moved around them with the familiar sounds of a community at its ordinary work, and she felt the mate bond settle into something she had no word for. Not the bright, urgent thing of a new bond, not the thin wire of exile, but something matured. Something that had been tested and survived, that had stretched to nearly breaking and returned. She was Celine of the Ashvale pack. She had crossed the Thornwood and come back, carrying the truth in her hand. She had stood in the council chamber in shoes she had demanded, and made her case, and been believed, and she had not done it to be worthy of him. She had done it because it was right, and because she was equal to it, and because she had always known, even at the worst moment, that she was. The choice to stay, to let him hold her face in his hand, to let the bond between them settle into this new and tempered thing, was hers, made clearly, made freely, made with both feet on the ground of her own territory. That was what it meant to come home.